Hi, everyone. Welcome to Azure User Group Sweden. And thank you so much for tuning in live with us today in our user group meetup, virtual meetup. Today, I'm alone. Håkan is actually sick today and supporting us backstage or with us watching as well. So I would like to welcome everyone. If you're new to our community, my name is Jonah Anderson. I am the founder of this community and user group. I am one of the community leaders of this group, and we are running this community-driven events every 2 weeks with fellow leaders in the community. And today we will have a session about learning the secrets that you need to know more about Azure storage. And I believe we have friends already saying hi. So we have Eric saying hi to everyone. We have Rema. I hope I pronounced it pretty well. And we also have our friend Nikos from Malmo. So I see that you're very curious about the session. So before I show the code of conduct and go through the routine that we have, I want to share also that I'm wearing a .NET Run t-shirt today. So it's a t-shirt that I bought a few years ago when Scott Hanselman showed it for a charity or purpose of like supporting Black girls who code. So it's good to wear this again today. So before we bring or start our session, let me just share our code of conduct. So our community follows a code of conduct that says be nice and friendly, listen with purpose, and be thoughtful in your comments or feedback or interaction with others. Be respectful, seek to understand, not criticize. Be curious and be open to share your ideas or knowledge with others. And be inclusive with your comments, feedback, or questions. And if you have any additional input about our code of conduct, feel free to reach out to me or Håkan on LinkedIn so we can like improve it. And to those that are fans of Azure Heroes, you are welcome to claim your digital learner badger by scanning this QR code. And feel free to share it on your social with this hashtags and mention Azure Heroes. And it is actually a community initiative by Microsoft to inspire learners of Azure with the community. And if you are interested, there's also an associated learning path for this session. If you go to bit.ly, ASUG Sweden dash Azure Storage, you will find a learning path module from Microsoft Learn where you can learn more about the session later on. And then after the session, we usually have the routine of like fika, which is a tradition we have that to those who have time can join us 15, 20 minutes with our speaker and ask questions that you do not dare to ask publicly. So it's very casual, laid back way of interacting and mingling with us via Zoom. So that is the link that you have that you can join in later on. Okay, before I start, let me just make a proper introduction to our speaker. Let's bring him to stage so it's more, so we see the image. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
Good morning. Yeah, I'm great. I'm great. Awesome. How are you doing today?
Yeah, all good. All good. Looking forward to the
Yes,
session.
yes. And this is your second comeback in our community, I know.
Yes, yeah.
Yes,
It's
so
been a
welcome
while,
back.
but yeah.
Yes, we have a lot of like speakers that wants to come back, and there's a lot of things to share. And today is a great topic that I myself is interested to learn. But before I bring you more to, bring you to stage more and with the topic, let me just properly introduce you. So, John Kilmister is a Microsoft MVP, uh, and he is a principal software architect and a software engineer that's enjoy exploring new technologies to solve real world problems. He has a background in e-commerce, and he currently works as a principal software architect, working with teams on both web and mobile applications. And I know that John is a friend in the community who shares a lot about Azure related topics to the community. So we're so happy to have you here, John.
Thank you.
Yes, anything you want to share to our live audience today before you start?
No, not really. No.
Yes. Okay. So let's see. Let me just share your presentation and let's see. The stage is yours.
Thank you. So, firstly, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to talk about blob storage and unlocking its potential. And this talk, we're going to assume a little bit of knowledge around blob storage, but nothing in depth. And what we're going to do in this talk is we're going to talk about a broad range of features, some of them new, some of them in preview, but also some of existing features that you might not know about. Before we get too far through it, sorry. Before we get there, I'll just introduce my social accounts. So you can find me at John Kilmister on Twitter and on all the other socials. And I have a blog at blueboxes.co.uk. And as already been said, I'm a software engineer and architect. I've been working in the industry now for over 20 years and mainly focusing on C# and Azure. So before we talk about blob storage itself, we need to actually talk about the storage accounts, and that's where blob storage sits inside a storage account. First of all, I'm going to mention the standard V1 accounts. These are legacy and you cannot create them anymore, but if you've got an old tenant and accounts that were created many years ago, you might still have them. And the reason I mention them is because in order to use the features we're going to talk about today, you need to upgrade them to a V2 account. Now, when we create a V2 account in the portal, we have the option of a standard V2 and a premium account. Now, a premium account will be backed with SSDs and is only really applicable for Azure files rather than blob storage and other things. So today we're going to focus on the standard V2 account. And we can create that, just as a quick recap, by going into the portal, searching storage accounts, and following through the wizard. And what we can see down the bottom under performance is where we select our standard or premium. Now, a lot of these things that we have in the wizard for generating a new account, we are actually going to cover today. So a lot of the features that I show you where in the portal to change the settings, you'll actually also be able to do that when you create your account. So I mentioned that blob storage is part of Azure storage accounts, but there are some other things and it's worth a quick shout out to them. So when you have a storage account, as well as blobs, you also have queue storage, and this allows for millions of messages on a FIFO messaging queue basis. There's also table storage, one of the cheapest ways to store unstructured data in Azure, and Azure Files, should we want to use file shares and high performance file storage. Now, all of these other areas could have many hours of presentations on their own, so we're going to focus in on blob storage containers. Now, what are blob storage containers? Is this just a place to put things, or more precisely, a whole set of files? Well, in a way, yes, and this is the way I used to look at it. I used to just be, I need an application to store some files, I'll put it in blob storage, and I kind of forget about it. But what this talk is about diving a little bit deeper and seeing all the other features that you can get with Azure Blob Storage. And not just the features, how can we store and use that data efficiently, both cost efficiently and efficiently in our applications. And storage, even though we have lots of databases and things today, storage is the cornerstone of many, many applications. From storing images to JSON files, configuration, to sharing CSV files with our business colleagues, and many, many other applications. So in this talk, we're going to break all of the features into 3 core areas. We're first of all going to talk about data storage, how the files are actually stored in blob storage and the options around that, before moving on to data access, because it's no good just putting files in. We need to be able to retrieve those files and work with them. And finally, we'll look at data protection. No Azure service would be complete without data protection. And that is both security and how people access the files, but also about redundancy and protection against accidental deletion. So with that, let's take a look at the first area, which is data storage. Now, when you add a blob or a file into blob storage, you get to store it in 3 different ways. You can store it as a block blob. Now, this is pretty much the default way. If you use Azure Storage Explorer and you just drag a file in, it's going to select blob blocks, and you're going to block blobs, and this is going to be used for most of your files. It's optimized for large file uploads. So what it does is it takes your file and it chops it up into little blocks. For things like Azure AZ copy, those blocks are in 8 meg chunks, but you can make those blocks any size you want, up to 4,000 megabytes. And the good thing about that is it means that we can upload those files in parallel. So we get or upload the blocks, in parallel. So we get high performance for large files. There are 2 other types though, and one is an append blob, and this is optimized for when you're writing a file in sequential order, and we just keep adding more and more blocks to that file. It doesn't support updating any of the previous blocks that we've added. You can overwrite the entire blob, but we can't go back and amend individual blocks within that blob. Finally, we have page blobs, and these are optimized for read and write operations that are going to be random, so from different parts of the overall file. Now, this is what VMs are backed with in Azure, but there are a number of other use cases. I won't go into any more detail now, but there is a great article on the Microsoft Learn should you want to look. But this is the foundation for a lot of the other bits that we're going to be talking about, especially when it comes to thinking about high transaction uploads and costs and various other bits. So once we've chosen our block type, we then need to choose a tier. Now, every blob is going to be set to one of 4 tiers. We've got hot, cool, a new tier that was introduced called cold, and archive. We'll have a look at why you choose one over the other a little bit later, but it is worth noting that you can either set your tier explicitly when you upload your blob, or you can let it fall back to the default tier. Now, the default tier is configured inside the portal under the configuration settings, or when you create the account. And you can set your default tier to either hot or cool. It's not applicable to set it to archive, and cold hasn't been added to this list yet either. At any time, we can change our access tier, and we can do that in something like Azure Storage Explorer or with any one of the many APIs. You can see in this particular screenshot that under access tier, the current blob is marked as hot. Now, it's got inferred in brackets, and that shows that hot was the default tier, and that blob was added without specifying a tier. So I've mentioned that we've got these 4 tiers, but why would we pick one over the other? Well, it's all about compromise and deciding what's best for your use case. No one tier is better than another tier outright. It all depends on what you're doing. So in the hot tier, we have the highest storage cost, but we have the lowest access costs. So if you've got an application where you're writing lots of files, all those files are being accessed on a frequent basis, then hot is going to be the best for you. As we move down into cool and then cold, you have a slightly lower storage cost, but the access cost, a slightly higher access cost and a slightly lower storage cost. And that goes all the way down to archive. Archive has the lowest storage cost of any of the tiers, and it's actually about 1/10 of the cost comparing it to hot. However, the files are offline and you can't access them. You can read the metadata and some of the other properties around it, but the actual file contents isn't accessible. You first have to rehydrate it, a process we'll talk about later on, and move it back into another tier in order to access it. So the tier is all about this balance between your storage cost and your access cost. And your blobs can move between the tiers at any time. Well, I say at any time. There is a minimum time that a blob should stay in a tier in order to get the best cost benefit. For cool, the blob has to be in there for at least 30 days. For the new cold tier, 90 days. And if we put it into archive, that's 180 days. And that brings us nicely on to what we call the early deletion penalty. So I said a blob has to be in cool storage for at least 30 days. It doesn't mean you can't remove it from there beforehand. However, you will be charged for the remainder of the time. So if we take the example here that we've got a blob, we've decided it's going to be log files, and we want to access them pretty infrequently, so we put them in cool storage. Now, we put it in there for 20 days and we think, actually, I've made a mistake. I want to put it into hot storage. If we move it out after 20 days, you're still going to be charged for the remaining 10 days. So you have to pay for the entirety of those 30 days of it being in cool. And you'll obviously get charged for where it's going. The same is true and probably more relevant with archive. If we decide to archive a file because we've realized it's not going to be used, for example, a long-term backup of a SQL database, we might put that in archive because it's the cheapest way to store it. Now we realize we need to restore our backup. Well, we can't access the file because it's in archive, so we need to rehydrate it, move it out. But only 80 days have passed. Well, you'll still be charged for full 180 days of that file being in archive, in addition to the new charge of where it's going to go. The one big caveat of this is that moving from a default tiers are not affected. So this is a reason not to necessarily specify your tier and rely on that default access tier when you add a blob. So if I have my default access tier set to cool and I put all my files in cool, and then I decide actually I'm going to move it from cool to archive because I want to keep it for longer at a lower storage cost, I can do that at any point because cool was the default tier when it got added. I didn't specify a tier, and I can move that out after 10 days without paying the early deletion penalty. So we briefly mentioned about archive files needing to be accessed. So how do I go about getting that file back out of archive in order to read it? Well, that is through what we call the rehydration process. And you can start this rehydration process in either standard or high priority. If we say standard, it will take anywhere up to 15 hours in order to then get access to your file. And that can vary. Sometimes I've had it that it's actually really quick, and other times it's taken the full 15 hours. You can upgrade to high priority later if you want. If you think, oh, I've been waiting a couple of hours and now I want to go to, no, I really do need access, and you can bump it up to high. You cannot do the opposite. You can't start in high and go down. And you can select this rehydration process once again through all of the APIs, through the UIs that are available. And the file will eventually make it up to cool. But how do we know when it's made it there? Well, you can first of all check via the blob properties. These, again, can be read through the API or just look in the portal and it will tell you the current status of the file. But even more useful is that we can connect an event grid subscription, and this will raise an event on tier change, which will include the moving from archive to cool, or from cool to hot, or any other event. And this can be really useful if we're building applications and letting our end users decide if they want to archive or unarchive files. Now, we talked about moving files around using the APIs and the various bits and pieces, but what if we want to automate that process? Well, that's where lifecycle management comes in. And lifecycle management allows us to move blobs between access tiers based on a set of rules. It will also allow us to delete files to save money after a certain period of time. All the rules run once a day and are all based on the configuration, which we'll see in a minute. You can access these by looking at the lifecycle management on the left-hand side on your storage account and then clicking Add New Rule. But we're going to do a demo of that in a short while. So the kind of things we can do is we could move to cool storage from hot after 30 days after it was created. We could move it to cold after 90 days after it was created. Or we could actually just delete a file 7 days after it was last updated. Examples of that might be something like a log file. You want to keep log files for 7 days, but after that, you want to delete it. Or you can move to archive 30 days after it's accessed. And that's what we're going to have a look at now in a quick live demo. So if we switch across to the portal, we have a storage account here that I created earlier. And we're going to go down and go to lifecycle management. Now, to create our new rule, we just click add. It's a pretty simple process. We enter a new rule name. So we're going to archive after 90 days. And we want to apply that to all blobs in the account. You can filter it down and say only blobs starting with this. We talked about the blob types earlier. In this case, I'm just going to do our standard blobs. And there are subtypes. We'll come on and talk about snapshots and versions later on in the talk. Now, here we can only select last modified or created. And the reason for this is because we haven't enabled another feature. So if we go back and under our lifecycle management, there's a little tick box here that says enable access tracking. And in order to do last access date based rules, we need to tick this box. There is, however, a cost implication of this, and I advise you to go and read up about it if you do want to be using last access. But as you can imagine, last access is a lot more powerful than created. If you've got a log file, you'll probably want to say, okay, 7 days after created. But if you want to archive a file that or move it to cold if people aren't using it very much, you want to be using that. So if we go back around again and just quickly go archive after 90 days of last use, we'll quickly go to the next screen. And here we now have a last access value here, and we can put in a value of 90 days. You can then choose what to do with it. So we see all the actions here. We can delete the blob, we can move it to archive, move it to cold. Yeah, so in this case, we're going to move it to archive. It gives us a warning about the whole rehydration and early deletion fees. So we just quickly add that, and it is enabled. So the first time you create it, it can take up to 48 hours to activate, and then it runs once a day. If you want a code view so you can replicate it, you can get that from the second tab. You can have multiple rules, and you can be moving files around as needed. So let's go back now to the presentation. And talk about some other things that we can add to our blobs. So properties, metadata, and blob index tags. I'm only briefly going to touch on this, but for every blob, we can add additional information that doesn't affect the underlying blocks. Properties are predefined, so you've got things like the content encoding that you can see at the top of this, content language, and that can be useful because these can get passed out when the blob is served in a web browser and things. We have metadata, which are key values which you can just place against your blob and then read back later. And if you index your blobs with something like Azure Search, you can get access to some of that. And then we have blob index tags, which allow you to search and filter blobs based on the values that are there. Now, the index tags do only apply to the current version of the blob, and we'll talk about versioning in a minute, but it is a very powerful feature. So we've talked about storing our data, but as I said before, it's only useful to store our data if we can get back to accessing it after the fact. We've shown this already, but it's worth noting. So Azure Storage Explorer is a great way to work with your blobs. It is a cross-platform desktop application that you can download. It's open source, and it allows us to manage our blobs, and we can do many of the things that we're talking about today in here. So create containers, add blobs, remove blobs, change their tier, and various other things. It's also backed by AZ copy. So when you do actions, it's done with AZ copy, and you can copy the AZ copy commands back out again. But one thing that is a relatively new feature, we can now access Azure Storage Explorer from inside our Azure portal. So we don't need to download anything. The storage browser in here is not a like-for-like copy and is a little bit more limited, but I found it has the majority of the features and is really useful for quickly going in and managing your blobs. But that's if we want to manage, just handfuls of blobs. What if we're working with thousands upon thousands of files? Well, that's where the AZ copy tool comes in. Again, this is a cross-platform application. It's a CLI tool, so we would use it with a PowerShell or Bash scripting language. And it's really optimized for that parallel upload and working with large amounts of files at a high transaction rate. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to look at a few of the commands that AZ copy can give you. It is a huge tool and can do an awful lot, but I thought it was worth just picking up on a few commands that you may not have come across. So a basic copy, we can just take a folder that we've got locally or an individual file and upload it to our account. This can be authenticated with a SAS token or with storage account keys or with service principal. There are many ways you can authenticate with AZ copy. But we can also include a pattern. And if we're going to use any of these AZ copy commands, it's well worth looking at the documentation and seeing all of the available patterns. Now, I've mentioned that AZ copy is optimized for high capacity file upload. But a preview feature that's just come out is AZ copy bench. And this is really interesting because what you can do is give a container and a number of settings, and it will upload lots of sample files and then produce you a log file, which is a report of all of the performance and timings around that upload. So if you know you've got many gigs worth of files to upload, but you want to estimate how long it's going to take, you can use the bench tool. There are parameters for things like the block size, the file size, and how many files to upload. So if you want to do some benchmarking on your current connection from maybe different machines, different locations, then this is a good option. AZ copy also does remote copying. So you can copy from one blob container to another, and then it's not going to download the files in between. So it's a direct copy, which is going to make it really powerful. But it can also copy from things outside Azure. So we can copy from a AWS bucket or a Google storage account across into Azure. So if you're migrating data or you need to keep things from another cloud provider, it can also do that. And because we are, this is a command line tool, we can wrap it into larger Bash or PowerShell scripts and automate those on VMs and various other things. There's also the local sync command, where it can take a local folder and it can sync it up with a container. It doesn't just do local syncing though. We can also use the copy sync command to synchronize across 2 blob storage accounts, or from Azure Files across to blob storage, and many other scenarios. Now, all of these things we talked about with blob storage happen in parallel and are all done through a set of jobs that it creates. And we can see those jobs by going AZ copy job list. So you can see if they're in progress or if they've been interrupted. Another feature of AZ copy is that it supports being interrupted and then resuming later. And if we need to resume, we can just do AZ copy job resume, give it the job ID, and continue the job. So we talked about managing large amounts of files, either in bulk, but what if we want to give access to those files to other people? Well, there are 3 core ways of doing that. We can do that through access keys. However, access keys give access to pretty much our whole storage account, and we want to avoid doing that. We can even go into the configuration of our storage account and forbid the use of access keys, which is probably quite a good security option. We can create SAS tokens. SAS tokens get generated against a container or a blob with start, end dates. We can block IP addresses and give appropriate permissions. But probably a lesser used feature is access policies. So with a SAS token, as you can see here, the URL contains all of that information and also a signature to stop it being modified. With an access policy, we can bundle all of that information into a named policy and then attach that policy to the SAS token. This means we can modify the policy and manage it more centrally. However, all of those mechanisms do require the end users to then use Azure Storage Explorer or one of our APIs or various other ways. What if we want to give access to the data in a way that people are more familiar? Well, we can give them SFTP access now with blob storage. I'm going to cross over back to show you a very quick demo on this. So in this storage account here, we don't have the option to turn on FTP. If we go down to the place we would look to expect to see it under data management, it's not there. We don't have any options. And that is because in this particular account, we have not enabled hierarchical namespaces. So when you add a blob to an account and storage account and you create a folder, all you're really doing is changing the name of that blob, and it happens to have forward slashes in it so that it is shown to you in Storage Explorer as a folder, but it is flat. If you want to rename the folder, you have to rename every blob underneath it. So it's not a real file system. Hierarchical namespaces gives us that real file system, and that is needed if you want to do FTP or NFS version 3. So I have an account where I've already enabled it. If you have an existing account and you want to enable it, you can do that through the Data Lake Gen 2 upgrade process. So if I now go back and have a look at this account has hierarchical namespaces enabled here. So we are able to look at SFTP, and as you can see, it's enabled there. When we do that under settings, we can now see SFTP has appeared. And from here, we can just add in a new local user, give them a username, so test user 1, for example, and decide if we want to give them a password or the more secure option of a SSH key pair. Once we've done this, we can pick an individual container to give access to. Unlike a SAS token, it has to be a whole container rather than just an individual blob. And then we select the permissions. And these permissions are SFTP permissions. So they're things like list, write, read. So we can give read-only access, for example. And as it is a SFTP account, we can specify a home landing directory. Once we add that, our password is shown to us, and we would note that down. And along with the username, we can then provide access as the connection string as well to our business colleagues, for example, to access the files that way. And that can be really useful. Another way is through a static website. So we'll switch back and have a look at how we can create a static website. This is a feature that's been in Blob Storage accounts for some time now, but there have been some new additions. So it's worth, let's have another look. I will switch back to our account without hierarchical namespaces, although you could equally use that. So if you want to share all of the files in your Blob Storage account, we can create a public container. So I can come in here, click container, and you can set the anonymous access level to public. Now I can't do that here because under the settings of my storage account, I've disabled any public access. So if I go into settings quickly, settings, never find it when you're looking for it. Settings, just type it in. Oh, it's configuration, that's why. Configuration. So under configuration, allow anonymous blob access. It's disabled by default, but if you wanted to make one of your blob stores completely open, you can enable it here, and then upon creation of your container, you can then set it to public. However, there is a better way, and that is using so if we get rid of that, if we come down here, we can use a static website. So once we enable a static website, we get some additional options, and that will be an index document name. So this is more useful if you were just to make a public container that was completely open, and you put a HTML file in there. You would have to put the full name of the file in. By doing this, when we go to the root, it's automatically going to load index.html. So we save that, and now if we have a look at our containers, we'll see we've got a new container called $web. We can go in there, and this time we'll use storage browser just to quickly upload 2 files. So go into the web, we'll upload 2 files. So we're going to upload our index file and our nice cat picture. Once that's uploaded, if we go to the endpoints, search for that. Endpoints, you will see, you would see under here our static ID. And I've just got this masked at the moment, but I have copied it to the clipboard. And if we go to it, we should see our website. And yeah, there's much more that you can do with it. But what I've tended to do with this kind of thing is if I've got a large number of CSV files that I want to share with people, I'll just keep adding, my application will keep adding them to that blob store, and then I can serve them like this. Now, this isn't a custom domain name. It's not optimized, but we can do that now if we want by going to front door and CDN access. So before, you used to be able to give it a custom domain name, but it was a real challenge to put an SSL certificate and various other things on it. And CDNs, you had to configure completely separate. This is now all part of the service. So you can come in here and you can set up a front door. You can add CDN, caching, custom domain names, and various other bits and pieces, including like a WAF and other bits and pieces. So that was a really quick look at static sites. But why would you want to use a static site? Because we do now have Azure Static Web Apps. And in many cases, this is better. And I would recommend if you've got a static website to actually use Azure Static Websites. Well, the main difference is the direct file access and the API that provides. In a static Azure Static Web App, we are taking a website, going through a build process, maybe on GitHub or DevOps, and publishing our website. But once that website's published, you don't have direct access to the individual files. So if you want to keep uploading new files for people to download, for example, a static web app on its own isn't going to do that. With an Azure site on a static site on Azure Storage, you can give direct file access and you can upload and things. I kept talking about our applications accessing the data. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there is a REST API that sits over the top of this. And many of the tools we've looked at are do use the REST API under the hood. But the REST API can be a bit challenging to use. So there is a whole set of client libraries that Microsoft provides in .NET, Python, Java, TypeScript, all of them. And they use and utilize the language's features in order to give you the best experience and also make it really easy for you to access the storage. And these allow you to change access tier, create new containers, pretty much do everything that we've talked about so far. Very, very quickly want to touch on blob leases. If you want an exclusive lock on your file, you can acquire a lease on a blob. Then any further actions that you need to do, you need to provide the ID that you get when you take out the lease. So you take out the lease, get an ID, then all actions must include that lease ID, and then you can break the lease, and then other people can access the file. It can be quite useful depending on what you're doing. And a few other features. We've zipped through a lot of features there, but if you want to mount a network share to blob storage, if you're on Linux, you can do this, but you need to, again, enable hierarchical namespaces. You can do that through NFS3. Azure Search, if you want to search all the contents of your blob, there's an option for that. Storage Mover is great for migrations and is an alternative to AZ Copy. And you can also use metrics to analyze how many blobs you have in each storage tier and various other things. So the third and final section that we're coming to now is data protection. And in some ways, this is the most important. If the blobs are the cornerstone of our application, we want to make sure that they are protected. We can make sure that we don't have data loss and that everything is going to work for us. So the first thing I want to talk about is data replication. And this is an option you pick when you create your storage account. You can change it later, although there are certain caveats and with it and certain challenges. So definitely read around if you think you might want to change it later. Now, with the replication, I used to be this. I used to just pick one or leave it as the default without really understanding what's happening behind the scenes. And by understanding what's happening behind the scenes, we can make a better, more informed choice. These images, by the way, are direct from the Microsoft Learn site. So if you want to read up more about this, there's a great article on there. So the first thing is locally redundant storage. What does that mean? Well, it means there's going to be 3 copies of our blobs, all within the same data center. It's completely transparent to you, but it is 3 copies. If we go zone redundant, that means that they are in different availability zones. So if there is a outage, a network outage or a power outage inside a data center, the other copies are still available and there for you. But that is all within one region. If we want to go outside the region and have better redundancy, we can use the geo-redundant storage. Now, interestingly with the zone redundant storage, we still have 3 copies. They're just split across different availability zones. When it comes to the zone redundant storage, it is in a different data center, a different region, and therefore we actually end up with 6 copies. However, there are some big caveats with this. The only time you will go over and use the second version is when it has been a complete loss in the primary region. The DNS will get changed and there will be an outage between failing over from the primary to the secondary region. So if you use the geo-redundant storage, your application must understand there might be a time when the data is not available. And that might not be a problem for you, but if it is, you will want to be looking at the read access options. All of these types that I've spoken about so far have an SLA of 99.9%. If we use the read access geo-redundant storage, in that scenario, we don't get an outage as it fails over because your application can read from the secondary location. However, your application code does need to be adjusted to take advantage of this. And that's something that I've seen before is where people enable read access geo-redundant storage and don't necessarily update their application. Once you do this, and once you go to the read access geo redundant storage, the SLA increases to 99.99%. A lot more detail behind that can be found on the Microsoft Learn site. So, okay, we've replicated the blobs, and in a hardware outage, we have a way of getting it back. But what about people overwriting our blobs? What if they upload a blob and realize, oh, I've just gone and deleted a load of data by overwriting it? Well, we can enable blob versioning. So blob versioning will create a version every time you upload the file. It will create you a new version. And if we think back to, right back to the beginning when we talked about the blob types, it is only doing a delta of the different blocks behind the scenes. So we're only paying for the difference in the blocks. And we can view the versions just by right-clicking View Versions, and you can go back to any of them. And it will keep all of the versions, and it's completely automatic once you've turned it on. And that's where the lifecycle management can be really useful, because we can say delete any version that's older than, say, 30 days, and that will help us reduce our costs. Now, what if we don't want it to be automatic? What if we don't want to capture every single change? Well, we can create a snapshot, and snapshots are much like versions. However, they are taken at a time that you request. So we say we need a snapshot at this point. So manually taken. Snapshots are only applicable for hot and cool. And as I mentioned, you'll build for those unique blocks. However, there is a caveat with that again. So if you change the tier of a snapshot or change the tier of a version, so your snapshot and tier versions can be different than your base blob, you are then charged for the entire blob again. So just something to be aware of. You can change the tiers of your snapshots and versions, but you're not then charged for the delta, you're charged for the entire lot. We can also enable soft delete, because yes, we can take backup copies of versions, and that helps for overwriting. But what if someone just goes and deletes things out and out? Well, that's where soft delete comes in. We can enable that for either the container or for individual blobs, or both. And it will start keeping backups for that duration. Configurable between 1 and 365 days, and then you are charged for the blocks until they're fully removed. Storage accounts with hierarchical namespaces. So if you've enabled NFS network shares, because hierarchical storage to use that feature, or if you've enabled SFTP and enabled a hierarchical namespace, then you're not going to be able to use soft delete. If you want to get something back after you have soft deleted it, the UI will allow, if the Storage Explorer will allow you to do this. You can also do it through the portal and various other ways as well. So we've once again zipped through a lot of different features there. And there are a few other features I just want to kind of briefly touch on, but not go on too much detail. One is immutable storage. Immutable storage allows you to set up a policy. And once you've set the policy, then the blobs cannot be changed in any way while that policy is in force. So if we set a policy up for a year, then the blobs are not changeable for a year. And that means that even Microsoft can't go in and delete them or change them or update them or anything else. So if you've got a regulatory requirement, immutable storage can be really useful, but there is a lot of detail behind that, and it is well worth reading in detail before you use that feature. If you've used virtual machines, then you'll be familiar with point-in-time restore and Azure Backup. Both of these are available over in Blob Storage. There's also a feature called change feeds, because it's great to have backups of your blobs. If someone deletes it, we can have soft delete, but obviously only for the period that you've set it. The change feed is an audit of everything that's going on in your storage account, and it gets written to a new storage container, and it's a text file, log file that you can go and interrogate should you need that. Again, very good for regulatory compliance. And then finally, Azure Defender, like many other services, Azure Defender also covers storage, and there's a whole load of bits that you can look at in regard to that. It covers things like malicious access, checking for malware being uploaded. So if your web app is uploading to Blob Storage, this can be a really useful feature. So that was a very quick tour through a very broad range of features. We looked at data storage. So if we think about the different tiers that we can use and how the underlying blobs are being stored in these small blocks, which has an impact when we start later on thinking about things like versioning, snapshots, and various other costs. We had a look at data access and talked about all of the different mechanisms. Should we be using a UI to just manually tweak things like Azure Storage Explorer, using a CLI tool for large file operations like AZ copy, or using the APIs in order to automate that and really enrich our applications with blob storage. Then finally, we talked about data protection, one of the most important things in many ways, and many of the data protection features are enabled by default when you create a new account. But it is good to understand them so we can configure them and decide what suits your usage the best. And that's everything we covered. We've only briefly touched on each of those points, and I really do encourage you to have a look more if you are looking at using those features. But hopefully it's given you a bit more of a background and something that you can, something to inspire you to go away and look more at. So if we have any questions, I'm happy to take them now, or we do have that session separately afterwards as
Yes.
well.
Yeah, thank you so much for the great presentation, John. I learned a lot of extra things about Azure Storage, which makes me like list down some of the questions I have, which relates to infrastructure as code stuff. But
Yeah.
we do have a few questions from our audience while you were doing a presentation, so I saved them. Let me show one from a user from LinkedIn. It didn't show the name, but he or she asked, are all these penalty costs transparent somehow, either upfront or in a cost center gov tool? I'm not
That
sure
is
if you understood the
Yeah, I
question.
understand the question. Yeah, so I think this refers to like the early deletion penalties and things like that.
Mm,
So you're not notified necessarily when you do it, as in like when you rehydrate, it doesn't go, this has now cost you. It does warn you as you do it. And I believe it actually shows you when you do the rehydration, it will show you the the time it moved to the last tier. So you can see it as you do it. As far as like cost reporting is concerned, you can use the Azure Cost Center to see where your blob costings, and I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe it is itemized in your bill as well, but I'm not 100% sure. Personally, I haven't looked too much into that side of things.
yes, that's right. Yeah, I think one good tool also in finding out the cost is also the Azure pricing calculator, the cost
Yes.
calculator. Yes, which can
Yeah.
be useful beforehand, but the penalty one may be something that also needs to look up to on the side.
Yeah. Unfortunately, blob storage cost is very hard to calculate. So
Mhm.
it's not impossible, but it's dependent on because the individual blobs that are at different pricing tiers. So some of your blobs will be in hot, some will be in cold, some will be in archived. Um, then obviously your blobs are all different sizes. So you've got different amounts of data. And then when you talk about versioning and snapshots, you're only paying the delta. Um, and then on top of that, it depends on what redundancy you've got in place to if you've got read access geo redundant storage, that's going to be at a different price for all of those things that I've just mentioned. So it can be a bit of a challenge, and data, I often find it's hard to estimate how much data you're gonna need as well. So yeah, it
Mhm.
can be a challenge. And I think when it comes to early deletion fees, the way I tend to look at it is that it's about thinking up front about how often you're going to need to access that data. And it tends to be, for me, it's an exception rather than the rule that I will kind of incur one of these costs. So, for example, I'll put it all in archived and then we'll go, oh, we need to restore a backup. Now, that scenario is extremely rare. And at that point, we can go, well, you know what? It is a very large file. We know we're going to pay for the 180 days. It's going to be in archive storage, but it's not the the main thing to be aware of is if you set up the lifecycle management rules, they're going to move things out of cool storage into archive, or out of archive. From cool storage to archive after 10 days, and it's not your default tier, for example.
Yeah.
You're then going to have a lot of blobs that are going to fall into this. Or if you write your application and you allow users to move things between tiers, you might find users start doing it, and then you'll build more than you think that you are. So it's definitely something to think of, probably more so when doing automations and your own account, or if you've got very, very large things. But yeah, you're charged for the entirety of the 180 days, whatever you do. And then if you moved it out after that time, it's going to go into your new tier, and then you're going to start charged for that new tier from whenever you put it in. So
Yeah.
just something to
Yes.
bear in mind.
It depends on the use case, as you said earlier.
Very much so.
We consult us. Yeah, I know. Also, I think the secret in also minimizing the cost is having this data strategy, like really finding out what kind of data you're storing and how long you're gonna keep it or use it often, because this is when the tiers for the Azure storage are relevant for
Mm.
cool, hot, or archive when it is necessary. Yeah, thank you for the answer. Hope that the user that asked this question in LinkedIn are satisfied. We have one more question. Let's
Okay.
see. How do we store SharePoint audit logs to Azure Storage?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not
Yes.
a SharePoint expert. I don't really use SharePoint myself, so
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't necessarily answer that. But there are lots of because it has such a broad range of APIs. Then you can there should be a way of doing it. And as it's a Microsoft product, there may even be some built-in integration. I mean, off the top of my head, you could use something like Logic Apps, but I
Yeah.
would guess that probably isn't the optimum way of doing it. There are probably other ways of doing it, and it depends how SharePoint audit logs work. If you wanted to do it nightly, or you wanted to stream them in, and various other options. So unfortunately, I can't answer the question directly, but I'd be quite confident there is a way of doing it
Yes.
that has been
I did.
thought
I
of.
did sneak Google a bit
Eh,
to help out. I see that it's actually possible to copy files, data, log files from SharePoint using Azure Logic Apps, as you already answered. So
yeah,
that's one of the ways, and definitely there are different integrations with those applications as well to Azure. Yeah.
right.
Okay, I think let's see if we have more questions. Oh, one more questions from Nikos. Here. Would you recommend using Azure Storage instead of Dropbox? If yes, then how? Which blob type and tier?
So it really depends on what you're using Dropbox for. If you're using Dropbox like OneDrive, then my personal suggestion would be probably not, because although yes, you can mount an NFS network share to it from a Linux machine, it's not really it's not the same as say Dropbox or OneDrive, in which it's scanning your files, deciding what to sync, and various other bits and pieces. So I wouldn't say it's a like for like replacement by any means on like storage in that way. You might even want to look at something like Azure Files potentially, but if you're using Dropbox in a broader sense, and you're using the Dropbox API and you're using it as the backing for your web application, then there might be a use case for switching over. But it really, I think, I wouldn't think of it as user file storage. I would think of it more as application file storage. That'd be
Okay.
my personal take on it. I don't know what you
Yes.
think.
Yeah. 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 I think it really depends on your purpose. To be honest, I actually have both. And I know that I mean, Azure Storage is very flexible, especially for you. I mean, for us developers who develop with Azure, but it really depends on what you're trying to use it for,
Yeah.
actually. And if you have Azure Storage unlimited capability and you have more control of that, I think I would rather use Azure Storage, to be honest. So I'm moving away from Dropbox.
That's interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
I guess it depends, as you say, on a user. I mean,
Mm,
personally, I for my those kind of files, I use OneDrive.
mm,
Yeah, if you're
yeah.
looking, and that's where, because I it's that syncing of the files, making sure that they're update and that you've got an
Mm,
offline copy and various other bits and things you wouldn't necessarily get with this. And as I say, um, Azure Blob Storage particularly is backed, I believe, by spinning disks, where premium storage and Azure Files is backed by SSDs. So again, it does depend on what you're using it for.
mm.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
as always with everything in this world, it depends.
Yeah,
But
we're all consultants and problem solvers anyway. Every problem is unique.
yeah,
Yes. Let me just remove this one so we have more space in the stage. Let me show you one more questions. Our audience are asking last minute questions because it's getting interesting. Martin
uh,
Dahlborg, in your view, is it worth putting the effort into upgrading from gen purpose V1 storage account today as a general approach to
so this
decrease
is interesting.
cost or improve? Yeah.
Yeah, so Gen 1 storage, as I say, you can't create them anymore, but people do have them, and I had them for a long time before upgrading. Um, in some scenarios, Gen 1 storage was cheaper to store your data than Gen 2, depending again on your scenario and your use case. So I don't know if that's still the case. I looked at it probably a couple of years ago when migrating. So yeah, as far as cost is concerned, I would definitely go and have a look at that if cost is your main driver. Improve security. Um, I don't know actually. That's an interesting one on the security side, but you are missing out basically on all of the new features. Being a legacy thing, that you're not going to get your soft delete, you're not going to get your file access through SFTP or through NFS. You're not going to get I think it might support versioning. I can't remember, but there are many features that are missing. It really was a V1 product, and I think Microsoft's recommendation is to upgrade. But as I said, there was a time when you could create both V1 and V2, and the Microsoft documentation said that in some cases it was cheaper to keep it on V1. But you'd need to go and have a look and see.
Yeah.
But yeah, the main reason I would say is to take ben- make benefits of the new features like lifecycle management. You might find it's cheaper to store, but then actually, if you can use lifecycle management, then you know you might actually find that you can then automate archiving things, and therefore you save more money that way. So yeah, you can't use lifecycle management in a Gen 1 account. I don't believe either.
Yes. And also, it's always expected that if something goes classic or old, it's expected that it will be deprecated after a while also.
Yeah, and you might find that
Yeah.
you struggle to get support as well if
Mm,
you raise a Microsoft support ticket.
yeah.
I don't know in this case, but with some other systems that have been deprecated, yeah.
Yes. All right. I think that's all the questions, and we got a thank you from all of them. From Martin, the latest question, and then the previous question from Srini, and everyone. Actually, you got a feedback. Thank you for a great session. Very informative. Abdul said important and useful session. So, and also Hokan. I know Ken. He's watching us right now behind the scenes, supporting us. All right. Yes. Any before we end our session and then switch to our Zoom after Fika, if there's more. Anything that you want to share, John? How people, our community, can reach out to you for further questions, or if you have any upcoming events or sessions that you want to invite everyone in.
Yeah, so the easiest way is through Twitter. That's you can direct message me, or you can just tag me in your question. But you can also find me on LinkedIn. Quite active there as well. And yeah, that's probably the best way to kind of, yeah. If you can't join the session later and you do have some other questions, or you just want to see the content that I'm producing, so I produce a monthly blog post on blueboxes.co.uk, normally around Azure and software engineering. Um, and I've got a new one coming out on Monday, which is for the Azure Back to School.
Oh,
It'll
you're
be
also
on
there. Yes.
yeah, KQL, and how we can leverage KQL to query our Azure infrastructure. So that's a blog post that comes out on Monday. But yeah, if you follow me on Twitter or Blue Sky or any of the other socials, you'll be informed when that's out. Yeah, I don't have any other talks coming up just yet, but I've got some ideas, and hopefully,
Yes.
again, if you follow me on the socials, I'll be posting that when I've
Yeah,
got
you're
stuff out.
welcome to come back and tell us more about Azure storage or whatever knowledge that you want to share with us in that level. It's interesting things. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. The time is out, but we will be switching to Zoom. So those of you who have time to spare with John, ask more questions about this topic. Feel free to join using the bit.ly link as Sug Sweden Fika dash 090923. That's the date today and the year. And yeah, we hope to continue our discussion there. But otherwise, see you again in 2 weeks. We have upcoming sessions for the rest of the month. And we do appreciate your time today. Thank you so much, John, and everyone.
Well, thanks for
Have a
having
great
me.
weekend. Bye bye.
Bye.